Serbia's president under fire for alleged corruption. Could months of protests force Alexander Vucic out of power? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmakers are the demonstrators in Belgrade. Last November, the leader of Serbia's opposition Left Party was on his way to a meeting when he was attacked. Resembling a scene out of a mob movie, a group of men with metal bars knocked the politician down to the pavement and beat him mercilessly. A mass protest against political violence erupted, and the demonstrations didn't stop there. Every weekend for the past 2 months, thousands of activists have braved freezing cold temperatures, and their demands have grown. They're calling for investigations into the killings of another politician and a journalist, and they want the Interior Minister to resign and a public plan to resolve tensions with Kosovo. While the protests have not reached the size of those that brought down Slobodan Milosevic, the comparison is being made. So, what does the future hold for President Alexander Vucic? Haider Abbasi went to Belgrade to find out.
The snow and ice hasn't stopped them from marching. Tens of thousands of people are rallying across Serbia. They say their democracy is being trampled upon.
But this is probably the most corrupt and the most authoritarian government that we've seen so far.
For 2 months, people in Serbia have been demonstrating every weekend, and the crowds are getting larger.
These protests brought together people from every section of Serbian society, from the young to the old, from actors and musicians to academics. And they're all united against one man, the President of Serbia, Alexander Vucic. The protesters say they'll continue to march until he resigns.
Alexander Vucic was elected in 2017. Before that, he served as Prime Minister with the Nationalist Progressive Party. But his victory 2 years ago triggered protests. Many said the vote was rigged. Since he's been in power, Vucic has been accused by the public of acting like a dictator. Demonstrators say he's undermining democracy and the rule of law, and that he's silencing all dissent. Vucic denies the accusations. He says even if 5 million people were to go out onto the streets of Belgrade to protest him, he'd continue to pursue his policies. The rallies began after this man was attacked. Borko Stefanovic is leader of the opposition Serbian Left Party. In November, he was beaten by a group of masked men.
At the moment I passed them, they hit me with the iron bars and the knuckle dusters. And from one strong punch in the back of my head, I fell unconscious.
For Stefanovic, it's clear why he was attacked.
I don't believe that Mr. Vucic or the chief of police ordered this. But I know that they are responsible because they have created this toxic atmosphere in our society for 7 years now, in which if you dare to be against the regime or to speak against it, you will lose your job, you will be slandered in the controlled tabloids, you will be a person with a target on your back.
Milan Jovanovic knows what it means to be a target. This is what remains of his home. It was firebombed last month. Jovanovic is an investigative journalist. He's published articles on what he says is corruption. I asked him why he thinks someone tried to kill him.
I've been writing about local strongmen in the municipality Groka. They've been stealing public money, and I wrote about them a few times. Also about the embezzlement that was taking place.
3 people had been arrested for the attack on his home. Last week, the president ordered the arrest of a local mayor who's accused of arranging it. Jovanovic says the president was protecting the mayor and that he was only arrested because of increasing public pressure.
This is the 3rd attempt to kill me in the last 2 years, to set me on fire along with my house. I have nothing now. No house, no home. All that's left are the pajamas I was wearing that night.
We'll have to change ourselves. We'll have to secure press environment. I will do it. And I'm almost certain that you're going to find no other leaders in the world that would say the same words as I'm doing today.
Here's Alexander Vucic speaking at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland recently. After returning from Davos, Vucic said he would tackle government corruption and political violence. But his critics don't believe him. They say it's just lip service because there's been more global attention on Serbia. Branislav Trifunovic is an actor and has become the face of the anti-government protests.
My shows and plays are forbidden in some cities, and from actually one of those people from his party. So I had my problems with them. I have a history of problems with them. So, but so far I'm in one of the biggest theater in ex-Yugoslavia. So I'm working there anyway. So they cannot harm me in that way, you know. But all the plays that I've done beside my theater, it was anti-regime and political, and it was some problems. But I don't give a damn about that.
Trifunovic says the protests go beyond Vucic and his government.
I think it's not just a way to make Vucic gone. I think that they corrupt all the system. So we got to change the system. So we have also a problem with opposition because they were nowhere in 7 years, you know. So, and a lot of them are in that regime before, and they did a lot of bad things. So, not bad, just like this guy.
There have been reports Vucic might call an early election to appease the protesters. But the opposition has dismissed the idea. They say it will be neither free nor fair. The protests are being compared to the mass rallies of the 1990s that helped topple the government of the leader at the time, Slobodan Milosevic. Is there enough public anger for this to happen again? Hader Abbasi, The Newsmakers, Belgrade, Serbia.
Well, to discuss this, let's go to our guests. In Belgrade is Vladimir Radomirovic. He's the editor-in-chief of the investigative news outlet Pištaljka, or The Whistle. Also joining me is Professor Dejan Vukstankovic at the University of Belgrade. And in Sarajevo is Marija Ristic. She's the regional director of the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Dejan Vukstankovic, let me start with you. Should Vucic be concerned? Is he in trouble?
Well, I don't think that he should be so much concerned with these protests, because those protests do not affect him so much. The latest polls shows that he is still a little bit above 50% of popular support. So he is much more popular than his opponents, especially because they do not show any signs of a rise in their ratings. So despite the fact that we have protests on a weekly basis in the last 2.5 months, Vucic is still very strong if we are considering his position in electorate.
Okay.
Also, he should not be so concerned. Okay,
let me bring in Marija Ristic and ask her if she agrees that even though people have been protesting for 2 months and they've got major issues that they're protesting, Vucic shouldn't be concerned.
Well, I think he should definitely think twice what he is doing. He is popular, and I agree with the colleague from Belgrade that he's definitely more popular than the opposition parties. But what we are seeing on the street is actually growing discontent with the people. And this is what we hadn't seen in Belgrade for a decent amount of time. And now we don't just see protests in Belgrade, but we also see it in the other cities as well. Then we also have universities or professors joining the protest. So I think this is a wake-up call for Vucic. It doesn't mean that he will go from power today, but if the issues such as rule of law and freedom of media continue, then there is a question whether he will stay.
Vladimir Radomirovic. So the protesters have accused Vucic of stifling democratic liberties, of cracking down on political opponents, of controlling the media. They believe that the country is going in the wrong direction. Is that true?
That is in large part true because the country is not reforming as quickly as it should. And Vucic is aware of this. Even though he dismissed the first protest, after the first protest he said that he doesn't care if 5 million people show up, he will never change his politics. Since then, he has said that he understands that people are dissatisfied with the condition, especially the upper middle class. And he's aware that he needs to push for reforms much harder. And I think most protesters are really on point in pinpointing these different sorts of problems for Serbia. And I think that Vucic will definitely have to change his policies in the near future.
Dejan, does he need to change his policies?
Depends what sort of politics. I don't think that he will change his politics substantially. He will propose new elections as some sort of exit strategy for ongoing political crisis. Despite the impression that we have protests on the streets in different towns and city of Belgrade, I'm not sure that those protests are enough strong to be a real and genuine challenge for Vucic.
So
he
Dejan,
is
let me
still
ask
more
you,
popular than
certainly,
his
let me interrupt you, and I apologize for this, right? But let me ask you, how big do they need to be for you to say, okay, he must get worried now because this is a critical point? How big do they need to get?
Well, they should be more like protests during the 90s. On the 90s, you had protests on daily basis, and they were more social actors that were involved in that. At this point, I don't think that something like that is possible. So if we are considering the political life in Serbia, I think it is a little bit superficial to claim that Vucic is autocrat in a way in which Milosevic was. And Vucic is a president that was directly elected on elections. He still have very strong support. And if you are talking about the media landscape in Serbia, you cannot say that Vucic is controlling all media. He has certainly some impact on very important TV stations and newspapers, but there are also room for the opposition dailies and weeklies and TV stations. It is also very superficial to claim that he is a dictator, because I don't know that in Serbia there is no political prisoners in Serbia, and there is no political parties and organizations that are forbidden. So sometimes it is a little bit, confusive to say that we live in some sort of autocracy or dictatorship. Vucic is a strong politician. He has authority, but that authority is won by people's support. And I'm not sure that it is plausible to claim, and it is rationally plausible to claim, that he is autocrat in a way in which Milosevic was.
Okay.
This country, by its constitution, is a liberal democracy, and if you want to be in a government, you should win elections.
Okay, so let's get Maria to
results of
respond
these
to that.
elections were recognized by all political.
Certainly. Okay, so let's get Maria. Maria, those words that many of the protesters have used, autocrat, dictator, do you agree with Dejan that yes, there might be problems, but calling the man an autocrat, a dictator, that's inaccurate, that's unfair, and it's irrational?
Well, Vucic is definitely not Milosevic, but we are also not a liberal democracy. Vucic's government, and he as the president, and his leadership, that all has characteristic of the authoritarian regime. It doesn't mean that it's fully authoritarian like some regimes that we know, some of them was Milosevic as well, but it has, for example, grip on two very important elements of the illiberal democracy. And one of them is freedom of media and freedom of speech. The other is actually rule of law. So we have a significant influence from the government coming on the most of the mainstream media, either through ownership or through political pressure. Then we have other element, which is that we actually don't have free judiciary. So there is a constant pressure on prosecutors, on judges, and on different kind of elements that constitute judicial authorities. So for example, in these two areas, and this is what European Union also says in their progress report, this is where we are not advancing towards what one democratic society should be. So it is definitely not Milosevic, but it is also not liberal democracy.
Vladimir Radimirovic, for those who would look at the protests and ask the simple question, is this about freedom and democracy, or is this about economics? Is it one or the other, or both?
I think it's both. You cannot divide the two. And in the past 10 years, as far as I remember, in every opinion poll, three topics topped all opinion polls. It's unemployment, corruption, and Kosovo. And I think Vucic needs to address corruption at this point. Being an editor of an anti-corruption website, we report almost daily on big corruption cases involving mid-level and senior-level politicians. And we haven't seen any closure in most of these cases, including the case of the current finance minister, Siniša Mali, who was suspected of money laundering 10 years ago. But this case was never really investigated. We never had any sort of prosecutorial engagement in the case. And the Minister of Finance of Serbia, we know this from documents that were released by the Anti-Corruption Agency, has offshore accounts in several jurisdictions across the globe. And to have a finance minister who made his money in Serbia and doesn't pay taxes in the country is really ridiculous.
Is there too much corruption, Dejan?
Well, I think that Vucic should be focused on corruption more than he's focused right now. He needs results in that field, and I completely agree with Mr. Radimirovic that he should initiate combat against corruption on systematic grounds. Also, all those cases should be resolved, and I think that is a real challenge for him. Corruption and, of course, advancement of the rule of the law, as Ms. Ristic just said. So I think that those fields are very important for him, and the success of his government will be measured according to those two criteria: how much and to what extent he could make progress in that fields. That will also describe that will be important for judgment about his policy. So those two areas which my colleagues mentioned are very important for not just for Vucic but for Serbia, for this society, and I think that government should work more on these two areas. That's quite correct.
Maria Ristic, one of the issues that Vladimir brought up was the issue of Kosovo. We heard very recently Hashim Thaçi sending a message to Donald Trump, sending a letter saying we're close to a deal with Serbia. How important is Kosovo to those people on the streets, and how much of an issue is it right now when it comes to what makes them unsettled and unhappy about their current situation?
Protesters at one point had like a demand for Vucic to actually start really talking to people and bringing the deal on Kosovo. And the protesters said that they believe that Kosovo is really important part of Serbia. But I think that most of these demands are actually irrational, and that if you would ask like general people in Serbia what are their main concerns, they wouldn't say that that's Kosovo. I think they would mention that it's actually corruption, economy, and other matters. So I think that Kosovo is more or less manipulated in all these political talks simply because it's a hot topic, and this is something that EU is demanding and the international community in general to resolve this long-standing dispute with Kosovo. But I think to normal and regular people on the street, I don't believe that that's an issue. The other problem is, of course, that these people are also manipulated by what is coming from the mainstream media and from the politician, and that is that Kosovo is actually part of Serbia, and that's very important for Kosovo to remain as part of Serbia, as it's said in our constitution. But in reality, actually, the situation is completely different. Serbia and Kosovo are completely two different territories. They're two different states, and we live in completely separated, I would say, worlds. There are people who live there and who are Serbs and who are in a way controlled by the Belgrade authorities. But in essence, we are speaking completely about two different countries. And this is the reality that Vucic knows, but he's not telling it simply because it means that he will lose points. And this is one of the reasons why he's actually trying to find a solution with Hashim Thaçi, but really trying to frame it differently to the public, because one of his politics and how he came to power, it was actually the story about Kosovo and not giving up on that part of once Serbia.
Yeah, and it is undoubtedly an emotional issue. I was in North Mitrovica just after Oliver Ivanovic was killed. There was a lot of saber rattling going on by both sides, right? So Vladimir, is Maria right that Kosovo is actually just this emotional tool used to manipulate people by the politicians, or it's more of a bread and butter issue that people deeply care about and want resolved right now?
It's a very emotional issue for all of Serbs, I think, and it's easy to manipulate feelings with such an emotional issue. But if anything were to happen to the remaining Serbs in Kosovo, you would never be able to reach any sort of deal between Belgrade and Pristina. And I think for Vucic to sell any sort of a deal with Hashim Thaçi or Ramush Haradinaj, he would need to control more of the media in Serbia than he is controlling now. And this is, I think, also where the interests of the EU and the US may at one point align with Vucic's interests, because if you want to sell any sort of deal where Serbia would recognize Kosovo, you need to control the media. And I don't think that, in any case, Serbs will accept a deal where Serbia will have to recognize Kosovo. Whether there will be partition or something else, we still don't know, but it's really an emotional issue and it will be hard to sell.
Okay, we have 30 seconds left in the segment. Dejan, I want to give you the final comment, briefly please, sir, on Kosovo. Go ahead.
Well, it's a very difficult issue, and I don't see how it will be solved in the near future, because both sides have completely different approaches and different expectations from the negotiation process which is happening in Brussels right now.
Okay. Dejan Vukstankovic, Vladimir Radmirovic and Maria Ristić, it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, could skyrocketing unemployment lead to the political downfall of South Korea's president? And is the US Supreme Court flexing its new conservative muscle? We debate why the justices upheld a ban on transgender troops. While protests are putting pressure on Serbia's leadership, unemployment is hurting the popularity of South Korea's president. The jobless rate is at an 8-year high, and Moon Jae-in's approval rating has dropped to 42%, the lowest since his inauguration. What's ironic is Moon campaigned as a jobs candidate. Well, in his way of improving the lives of ordinary citizens are so-called Chaebols, family-run conglomerates which have been eating up South Korean revenues and widening the wealth gap between the uber-rich and everyone else. With a closer look, Abu Bakr Shamahi went to the industrial city of Ulsan and filed this report.
The food at this market might be piping hot, but business isn't. Ulsan's traders have taken a big hit in recent years, and the reason is the South Korean conglomerate Hyundai. Job losses at Hyundai's Ulsan shipyard, the world's biggest, are having a knock-on effect. Traders like Kim Young-min say fewer workers are making the short walk from the shipyard to the market.
The heavy industries in Ulsan aren't doing well, according to the news. That's the biggest problem, isn't it? Business is down more than 50%. Consumers are not spending because they don't have the money. Jobs are needed for people to earn and spend money. But there are no jobs at the moment.
That view is echoed by one of Young-min's customers.
Many shops have been closing and people are losing money. My son is also a business owner, but he suffered a huge loss on what he invested and had to sell his business. It's a never-ending cycle.
Everywhere you look in Ulsan, you see Hyundai and its workers. The company built Ulsan from a small town in the 1960s to a city of around 1 million people today. The shipyard here is run by Hyundai Heavy Industries, and Hyundai Motors owns the car plant. They're part of the Hyundai Chaebol, a Korean word that refers to family-run conglomerates. They were the major reason for South Korea's economic miracle in the 1970s and 80s, as government backing helped them expand and dominate the economy. Some Chaebol are worldwide names, like Hyundai, Samsung, and LG. The 10 top Chaebol in South Korea had revenue equivalent to 2/3 of the country's GDP in 2017. Compare that to the US, where it takes the top 500 companies to make the same proportion. And the Chaebol are also seen as having close links to the government and benefiting from them.
Ulsan's fortunes are tied to one Chaebol, Hyundai. In this city, you can work for Hyundai, drive a Hyundai car, go to a Hyundai school or hospital, and even support the local Hyundai football team. Now that's all well and good when things are going well for the conglomerate, but what happens when they aren't? Well, then you get this, a row of closed shops for sale and for rent. You also have a situation where this city has gone from the richest in South Korea to a designated industrial crisis zone. The population went down for the first time in 2016, and exports went down too. And the question that has to be asked is this a symptom of over-reliance on one oversized Chaebol?
Hyundai is struggling with competition from China and rising labour costs at home. In addition to its business challenges, anger against Hyundai and other Chaebol has grown as South Korea's economy has worsened and corruption scandals emerge. Samsung's vice chairman and heir apparent was imprisoned in 2017 in connection with a scandal that brought down former President Park Geun-hye. And analysts say the economic dominance of the Chaebol squeezes out smaller firms and startups.
I think their time is finished and they need to find a better way of, more modernized way of running the business. You can find main negative effects in terms of unfair business contracting with small and medium-sized companies. So these small firms, small and medium-sized firms take account for more than 80% of employment in South Korea. However, they are undergoing an unfair, contracting relationship with big companies.
Chaebol may make the most money in South Korea, but they only employ 5% of the population. Most young people want to work for them, and some will wait until they get a Chaebol job, rather than work somewhere smaller for less. That's one of the reasons more than 11% of young South Koreans are unemployed. and Jun Hae-yoon is one of them. She wanted a job at a big corporation, but she's found success elsewhere. Her cartoons have an audience of tens of thousands on Instagram.
I heard that creating portfolios on a tablet PC would give me an advantage at a job interview. I've been preparing a portfolio to apply for a position at a large corporation, but didn't get the job, and didn't want the cartoon character I've created to go to waste. So I started uploading my work as cartoons, and meant for them to be seen by my mom and my friends only at first. I never thought I'd become famous because of them, so it came as a surprise.
Hae-yoon's cartoons feature a version of herself as she struggles to find a job, and they've struck a chord with other young South Koreans.
For me personally, I'll feel inferior and wonder to myself, is there something wrong with me? Am I just unlucky? Am I just not cut out for a job? So it affects my self-esteem. Many people thought they were alone, felt inferior, and were self-deprecating. But they realized there are others like them out there through my cartoons, and seek comfort in them.
Other young South Koreans find different ways to make themselves feel better. This is the Rage Room, where, for a price, you can take out your anger by smashing appliances, plates, and whatever else you like. Kwon Soon-won has been trying to get a job for a year, with no success. He's frustrated, but here, he can let off some steam before going back to the job hunt.
In South Korea and many other countries, there are more job seekers than vacancies in corporations, so it's hard to become employed. The process of resume submission, screening, and interviews is rigorous, and it's taking a toll not just on me, but on all job seekers. After smashing the TV and throwing plates against the wall, I felt a great sense of relief. I've been stressing out about finding a job, but I feel a lot better now.
President Moon Jae-in promised to create jobs, but instead, the unemployment rate has gone up since he's taken office. He'll have to act fast, or he might find that young people's rage is directed towards him, rather than discarded electronics. Wakil Shamahi, The Newsmakers, Seoul.
Well, joining me now from Busan, South Korea, is Justin Fendos. He's a biotechnology professor at Dongseo University and has written about unemployment in South Korea. And in Columbus, Ohio, is Robert Kelly, a political science professor at Busan National University. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Justin, let me start with you. For those who don't know, if you had to explain it briefly, are the Chaebols way too powerful in South Korea?
Are the Chaebols way too powerful? I would have to say yes. They do monopolize quite a bit of capital as well as disproportionate amount of political influence. So I would have to say yes.
Right. And Robert Kelly, so we've had the government saying we're going to sort this out. We're going to have reform and other labor reforms. Have they been asleep at the wheel and that's why people are now going on strike because they just haven't?
Yeah, I think the other speaker is correct. I think that Chaebol are much too powerful, actually. I think that's a pretty long-standing critique of Korean political economy. And yes, I think that the government really hasn't paid attention to these issues. I think North Korea has basically absorbed all of the attentions of this administration. North Korea has a way of doing that, the North Korean issue. And I think that's what's happened. I think the Moon government simply has been just overtaken by its effort to engage North Korea. It's absorbed all their energy.
Okay, so Justin, is that what happened? That they were just overwhelmed? They had too much to handle and they just put this on the back burner?
Well, I also think that there are some structural issues with Chaebols in the sense that the economy is now in a situation where it depends quite a bit on their income and their ability to continue moving GDP and exports. So it's actually kind of hard to touch them and to even out the economic balance in some respects.
Right. So, Robert, would you have to fundamentally change the way the economy works in order to properly reform the Chaebols?
Yeah, I think you would, to be honest. Yeah, it's a high hill to climb, which is why I think many governments have said they would try it. And then when they come to it, they often pass this up. I mean, literally, people have been talking about this since the mid 1990s when the Asian financial crisis hit South Korea. This has been a serious issue for 20 years. But yeah, it's so enormous. The companies are so influential. They're so large. They employ something like 10% of the workforce all by themselves. The top 20 corporations, something like that. They're very politically influential. They're very popular in South Korea. They enjoy an enormous amount of public support. Everybody wants to. I teach in South Korea, and all my students want to go and work for a Chaebol. They love it. It's sort of the idea of sort of success in South Korea. And that creates a lot of sort of resistance, right? It's just a very high hill to climb.
Right. It's interesting that you say that. So
And
there's an aspirational element. Yes, come in, Justin. Yeah.
Sorry. If I may add something, it's also easier to move these Chaebols when the economy is going well. And I think when the Moon administration first came in, they expected that the economy would kind of keep going at a fairly good rate of growth for a while. And so I think they were pretty serious about wanting to try, but with the recent difficulties, especially with the unemployment, they don't have an opportunity to really address this issue.
Yeah. So Robert, Chinese competition, high labor costs, issues with the Chaebols. South Korea's economy recording its slowest growth in 6 years, an aging population. Do people feel as if the economy is really doing badly there?
Yeah, I think they do. Again, sort of among the demographic that I see, sort of up-and-coming students, people in their late teens and in their 20s. Yeah, I think there's a fair amount of anxiety. Many of my students talk about going overseas, for example. Many of my students worry that top jobs and top slots in the country are basically reserved and locked up for those who are related to people or those who are sort of the sons and daughters of Chaebol executives and things like that. Social mobility in South Korea is a lot lower than you would think. That said, though, I think Korea's economic circumstances are actually better than most Koreans seem to think. I mean, South Korea didn't, for example, go through the punishing level of austerity that Western Europe and the U.S. went through after the Great Recession. But yeah, I mean, the South Korean economy needs to be shaken up. I would argue it needs to be deregulated. I think the South Korean economy is extraordinarily over-controlled by the state. But yes, I do think it needs to be shook up pretty substantially, yes.
Justin, let me ask you about corruption, because corruption brought down Park Geun-hye, right? So when we look at that, at least, has corruption been tackled to any extent?
Well, I do think a lot of things have been done. For instance, we have the Kim Myung-nan-pop, which puts a cap on the amount of the price of a meal, for instance, that you can buy for someone who's working for the government. So there are some laws in place to try to curb this, and it's become a lot more difficult to hide money, for instance. And the government also has more power now to check phone messages and look into instant messaging and things like that. So I do think it's more difficult than it was before, but at the same time, especially when you have Chaebols and these very powerful groups that are owned essentially by a single family and their relatives and friends, cronyism is pretty difficult to get away from.
Yeah, and Justin, will the people give Moon Jae-in the time needed to try and tackle this now?
At the moment, it's going to be difficult, I think, because I think there is enough discontent about the economic situation, particularly about unemployment. And the media has also kind of gotten on that bandwagon lately. And as you mentioned, Moon Jae-in's popularity has dropped quite a bit. So I think his priority at the moment will have to be to try to fix the jobs issue, to show some amount of progress to allay their concerns.
Yeah. So, Robert, you're nodding in agreement when Justin said the media is getting in on that bandwagon. Help me understand what they're saying.
Yeah, I think the emerging critique of the Moon administration is what your other guest said, right? Which is that they've really sort of fumbled the ball on the economy, right? And they spend an enormous amount of time on North Korea. North Korea is a huge time and attention sink. To be honest, they don't have a lot to show for it either, which I think is a problem. And a lot of other issues like anti-corruption and jobs have simply been pushed to the side, right? And you asked before, does Moon have enough time to get on top of this? The problem is the South Korean president only has one 5-year term. He's approaching the 2-year mark, which means people are already starting to think about the next presidential election. If Moon's going to move on this in a big way, he's got an 18-month window before he's a lame duck. And I just don't think that's enough time to take on something as big as corporate governance reform for the Chaebol.
You agree with that, Justin?
I do, yeah. I do think, again, though, that when President Moon first came in, he did try to implement a pretty drastic change in minimum wage and also significantly expand the public sector. So currently, only about 10% of all jobs in Korea are from the public sector, which is about half of the average from the OECD countries. So I do think that there was some desire and some initial effort to try to fund those efforts and try to create more jobs in that direction. But the current situation makes it pretty politically difficult to make any additional large moves unless the previous ones can be shown to have been successful in some way.
Robert Kelly, is South Korea's economy not diverse enough so that if one big thing goes wrong, you tend to have everything else dragged in that direction?
Yeah, that's actually sort of another line of commentary you hear a lot too, right? Which is the Korean economy is really dependent on just like 5 or 6 export sectors and stuff like that. Again, I would say that's primarily because the Korean government intervenes in the economy and directs investment so much. I think there's actually a lot of creativity at the bottom in the Korean economy if you look at sort of the small and medium enterprise sector, right? But the government just doesn't give those guys a chance to really compete against the big guys. Instead, you get this massive concentration on a few corporations and a few lines. And if one of those goes under, like the shipbuilding industry, your other guest and I are both from Busan. That's where I live in South Korea. There are people really, really concerned if the shipbuilding industry goes under in a serious way, that Busan unemployment is going to spike by like 10%. I mean, this is why the Korean government needs to sort of back off and let Koreans sort of act on their own a little bit more in the market, so it's not so dependent and not so connected. The economy is not so driven by just 20 corporations.
Right. So, Justin, is the government capable of backing off and leaving it to the South Koreans to try and figure this out?
Well, I think one of the reasons why it's tough to back out sometimes, as Dr. Kelly mentioned, is that the administrations change so frequently that, when they first come in, they want to try to implement a new agenda. And each time the agenda changes so quickly that, you move one step into the left and then you come back 2 steps to the right. And you end up being pretty similar to where you started most of the time. I would like to add one other thing, too, though, that when it comes to a lot of these employment issues, one of the other important things to remember is that a lot of small businesses have also been affected quite a bit by the way the economy has changed. And Korea actually has a glut of small businesses in many respects. So it has one of the higher ratios among OECD countries. There's about 1 small business for every 50 people, about 1 restaurant for every 70 people. And so there are also some just structural things that also have to work themselves out in a way. Okay.
Well, gentlemen, listen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Justin Fendos and Robert Kelly, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Transgender service members have been defending this country since the 1700s. We have always been there. We have always been in the foxhole. We have always had our battle buddies' backs, and we will continue to have our battle buddies' backs until we're told different.
Well, transgender troops have now been told differently by their commander-in-chief. The U.S. Supreme Court has lifted an injunction allowing President Donald Trump's transgender military ban to come into force. Trump first announced the move on Twitter, citing medical costs and disruption. The order dismantles an Obama-era policy which allowed transgender people to openly serve in the armed forces and receive medical care. Activists say it's another example of Trump's discriminatory agenda against the LGBT community. So what's in store for transgender troops now? Well, let's go to Washington, D.C. and ask Bryn Tannehill, who's a former pilot for the United States Navy, as well as the author of Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Trans. Bryn, thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Do you feel let down by the Supreme Court?
Absolutely. This is extraordinarily disappointing. Transgender service members are deployed around the world. They've been defending our country for decades, and they are over twice as likely to serve the country in the military as the general population.
When we look at their intentions, right, what do you think is behind this? Do you think that they really believe that your ability to fly a helicopter is impacted by being trans?
We can't exactly say what the Supreme Court's intentions were, given that they did not rule on the merits of the case. However, the intent of the ban itself does not take into account whether or not individuals are actually capable of serving. It judges them as a group without actually looking at the capabilities or how people are able to deploy, or if they're able to deploy. And we know that transgender service members are deployed around the world today and can deploy and do deploy.
Yeah, so Trump said that he consulted with his generals and military experts before making this decision. But the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army said something differently. Let's have a little listen.
I personally did not, but nor would I have expected to. And I noticed that's been in the media out there.
General Mark Milley basically said, I wasn't consulted, we weren't consulted. How does that make you feel?
Extraordinarily disappointed. I have been trying to get back into the National Guard for the past year, and I've always wanted to fly. I've always wanted to serve my country. I've always wanted to be back in the cockpit doing what I was trained to do. And to be judged based off of absolutely nothing, to have decisions made that affect me, my country, my career, my family, without actually doing any of the necessary research and consultation, simply based off of animus towards me as a transgender American, is extraordinarily disappointing given what I have done for my country and the sacrifices that me and my family have made across 4 different deployments around the globe.
Right. So you feel judged unfairly by the executive, by the DOD, by the Supreme Court. I wonder, give me some insight into what it was like within the military. What were the interactions with your peers like? Was there judgment during that time?
So I am the Director of Advocacy for SPARTA, an LGBT service members organization that primarily works on transgender service member issues, and most of our members are transgender service members. Our members are disappointed. They're worried about what this means for their careers and what it means for them as individuals and their families, and whether or not they'll be able to continue to serve. All of them are here because they are volunteers. We don't have a draft. We don't have conscription. Every last one of our members are people who wanted to join the military and to serve our country. And this is interfering with their ability to do their jobs. And they wonder how they will be judged going forward by their commands, by the military, by their branches. And you're absolutely right that this was not something that the military is consulted about.
Yeah.
All 4 branch chiefs said that transgender service members have not been an issue.
Right. I'm looking at the numbers. So according to a report issued by the Pentagon last year, there were around about 9,000 service members who identified as transgender. So they're within the system. It's an era of uncertainty. It's a difficult period. Is the message from this administration to those on the outside who might be transgender, who want to enlist at all, that, listen, don't you dare, this place is not for you? Is that the message?
Well, it's exactly the message, given that the policy being put in place expressly forbids anyone who is transgender from joining the military unless they don't transition. In other words, you can only join the military if you're transgender if you never do any transgender things. Essentially, this is a new don't ask, don't tell.
Bryn, half the country voted for Trump. I mean, it's debatable, a little bit this way or a little bit that way, but he's the president. It's a democracy. Who do you think public opinion is with?
The latest polling data from Marist University shows that 70% of Americans support transgender service and only 23% sided with the president. Yes, he is the president. He was democratically elected. However, presidents do not get to decide the civil rights of individuals unilaterally. This, to me, is clearly a violation of the 14th Amendment, where transgender individuals are being unfairly singled out and targeted by the United States government for discrimination.
So if he's doing it for the 23%, what do you think he's getting out of it?
The president has worked to ensure that his base supports him. And I believe that this move was made to play towards the base, who harbor animus towards transgender people in general.
And if I had to broaden it out, would you say this president has been bad for all LGBT people?
President Trump's policies and his cabinet's policies have generally been very, very hostile towards LGBT people in general, allowing for greater discrimination, taking away protections from LGBT people, and directly going after transgender service members.
Yeah.
So yes, this has been a net negative for us.
And even broader, just talking globally, for anyone who maybe not from a position of bigotry, but just from inexperience or naivety, finds it strange that transgender people would be in the military, your message to them would be what?
18 countries allow transgender people to serve openly. Most of them are our allies and people within NATO and people that we work with in coalitions in the world's hottest areas of activity in the Fifth Fleet and in CENTCOM. This is not something new. We are the only country that has ever decided to reverse ourselves on allowing transgender people to serve. We are now setting ourselves back, and we are not in alignment with what our allies believe and have found to be true.
Bryn Tannehill, it's been really great talking to you here on the Newsmakers. I thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.